Part 21. The Thin Air Music. The ascent of the great peak had reached its most transcendent and terrifying stage. For Ilara, the world no longer functioned by the rules of the valley she had left behind weeks ago. Gravity felt like a fading memory, a tether that was slowly being cut by the sharp edge of the altitude. As she moved into the final section of the route, she entered a psychological and physical landscape defined by what the locals called the thin air music, a state of being where the lack of oxygen and the sheer intensity of the struggle transformed the act of climbing into a spiritual symphony. Chapter 1. The Threshold of the Ethereal. The final section of the climb was now within Ilara's reach, appearing through the swirling mists like the spire of a celestial cathedral. As she crossed the invisible line into the death zone, the very chemistry of her body began to shift. The density of the air began to thin to a point of near nothingness, a sensation that would usually trigger a primal, suffocating panic. Yet, for her, it produced a strange sensation that seemed to systematically dismantle every fear she had ever carried. Every instinct that screamed danger was being muffled by a profound, eerie calm. This wasn't merely the absence of danger, but the presence of a higher clarity. It was a pure, high feeling, rising from within, as if her soul were expanding to fill the vacuum vacated by the oxygen molecules. Each breath was a conscious choice, a rhythmic prayer whispered into the biting wind, that as whipped across the granite face, she felt the heavy armor of her past falling away, the social anxieties, the ghosts of old failures, and the relentless noise of the world below simply could not survive in this rarefied pressure. They were too heavy, too molecularly dense to be carried this high. The silence here was not empty. It was a dense, expectant medium, vibrating with a frequency she had never felt before. As her brain searched for signals in the profound quiet, it began to translate the vibration of the mountain into something audible. She began to hear high-pitched synths, an airy sound that shimmered just at the edge of her perception. It was a note that lingered above the earthly plane, a celestial drone that seemed to anchor her to the sky rather than the rock. She wasn't just climbing, she was ascending into a song. The higher she climbed, the more the melody took shape, a haunting, electronic hum that it vibrated through the marrow of her bones. Chapter 2. The Geometry of Sound. In this state of sensory heightening, Ilara found a gentle comfort that is only granted to those who have the grit to conquer deep sorrow and physical pain. The music wasn't just an internal monologue, it felt as though it were being played by the mountain itself, the wind whistling through the ice. Crusted carabiners on her harness created a metallic chorus, while the rhythmic crunch of her crampons on the frozen neve provided a steady, percussive bass that kept her heart in time. Each movement was a note, each rest a rest, in the musical score of the ascent. Suddenly a new sound pierced the melodic wash, the sound of a tiny triangle, sharp and bright. It was a single, perfect pinging in the void, occurring at the exact moment her ice axe found a secure placement in the blue. Ice! Ping! It was the sound of absolute precision. It was the focused purpose of the final light, a sonic beacon guiding her through the haze of hypoxia and exhaustion. This sound was so clear it seemed to cut through the indigo sky, a needle of sound sewing her spirit to the summit. This was the moment Ilara had patiently enjoyed in her imagination for years. Every grueling training session in the freezing rain, every lonely night spent studying topographical maps by candlelight had led to this specific auditory reward. She wasn't just conquering a geographic feature, she was conducting a masterpiece. The triangle's note was a signal that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The void was no longer a terrifying emptiness, but a concert hall of infinite proportions, and she was its sole performer. She felt a kinship with the stars, which were beginning to prick through the thinning atmosphere. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Exertion. Ilara pushed upward, her entire universe narrowing down to the 3 feet of rock directly in front of her frosted goggles. She was focused entirely on the height, yet paradoxically she felt more grounded than she ever had in the world below. There is a silent moment in high-altitude climbing where the world stands still, where the past is a forgotten dream and the future is an irrelevant abstraction. There is only the now, punctuated by the burning in the lungs and the rising crescendo of the music. The pure release that true exertion brings is a form of secular ecstasy. Her muscles were screaming, her fingertips were cracked by the sub-zero temperatures, and her throat felt like it had been scraped with dry sand. Yet she felt a profound sense of grace, the strength that she had constantly endured for. The internal steel she had forged through years of hardship was finally being poured out in a single, magnificent effort. She was no longer a woman of flesh and blood. She was a manifestation of pure will, a localized storm of determination moving against the mountain's cold indifference. Chapter 4. The Internal Landscape. As the oxygen levels continued to drop, Ilara's consciousness began to fragment and reform in beautiful, strange ways. The physical world was becoming less about solid objects and more about energy and vibration. She saw the wind as flowing ribbons of silver light, dancing around the jagged edges of the peak. She felt the ancient memories of the stone beneath her palms, the cooling of the earth's crust, the slow heave of tectonic plates, the relentless scouring of glaciers over eons. She visualized the mountain not as a static mass of granite, but as a frozen wave of time. The thin air music became a bridge between her temporal human existence and the eternal patience of the mountain. Every time she reached for a hold, she was reaching back into the history of the world. The ping of the triangle was the sound of time itself being struck by the hammer of her will. She understood now that she was part of a grander composition, one that began long before her birth, and would continue long after her descent. In this state, her own identity became a secondary concern. She was no longer Ilara the climber or Ilara the woman. She was simply a point of awareness moving through a high-frequency environment. This was the true meaning of the thin air music. It was the sound of the universe observing itself. The synths she heard were the harmonics of the cosmic background radiation. The ping of the triangle was the collision of subatomic particles in the upper atmosphere. Chapter 5. The Indigo Finale. As she reached the final ridge, the sun began its slow, majestic descent toward the horizon. The light changed from a blinding, hostile white to a deep, resonant gold, and the sky overhead turned a shade of indigo so dark it was almost black. This was the final light, the illumination of the summit. The music reached a fever pitch, a complex arrangement of soaring strings and that persistent, perfect triangle. Every step was a struggle, a battle for a single cubic inch of air. Yet the music kept her upright. Ilara stood on the narrow summit, a space no larger than a prayer rug, surrounded on all sides by thousands of feet of sapphire-colored space. The world below was completely hidden by a sea of white clouds, making her feel as though she were standing on a lonely island in a celestial ocean. The silence here was absolute, yet the music in her mind was louder than ever. It was a song of triumph, but it wasn't loud or boastful. It was a quiet, internal realization of her own worth. She had conquered the mountain, but more importantly, she had found the woman she was always meant to be, the Ilara who was afraid of judgment, the Ilara who felt small in the shadow of others, had perished somewhere back in the base camp. The woman standing on the peak was a creature of the music, thin, bright, and resonant. She breathed in the freezing, oxygen-poor air, and for the first time in her life she felt truly and completely whole. The thin air music was her victory march, a silent roar that echoed across the roof of the world. Chapter 6. The Summit Watch. Even as the sun dipped lower, Ilara remained on the peak, anchored by the sheer awe of the vista. She was at the very tip of the world's finger, pointing directly into the heart of the galaxy. The stars were no longer distant points of light, but burning orbs of fire. So close she felt she could reach out and pluck them from the indigo velvet. The music grew more complex here, incorporating the low-frequency hum of the Earth's rotation and the high-pitched whistle of the solar wind. She felt the temperature plummet as the sun's warmth vanished, yet she was shielded by the glow of her own achievement. Her gear, the Gore-Tex layers, the down-filled parka, the heavy mittens, felt like a second skin, a pressurized suit for an astronaut walking on a foreign planet. She watched the shadow of the great peak stretch out across the eastern horizon, a vast, dark triangle that seemed to touch the very edge of the world. She looked out over the lesser peaks, which appeared like frozen waves in a vast, dark sea. She knew that her journey was far from over. The descent would bring its own challenges, and the parts of the novel yet to be written would hold even greater mysteries. But for now, in the final light of Part 21, she was the sovereign of the heights. She was the composer and the instrument, the climber and the mountain. The music was a living entity, wrapping around her in a protective embrace of sound. Chapter 7. The Eternal Echo. As the first true darkness of night began to fall, Ilara prepared herself for what was to come. She knew she could not stay on the summit forever, but she also knew that the summit would never leave her. The frequency of the thin air music had been etched into her DNA. Even as she turned to face the long, shadow path of the descent, she felt no fear. The music was a shield, a guiding light that would stay with her through the coming chapters of her odyssey. She paused one last time to look at the stars. They seemed to be singing to her, their light pulsing in time with the triangle's rhythmic ping. She realized that the thin air music was a universal language, spoken by the mountains, the stars, and the humans brave enough to listen to them. She felt a profound sense of gratitude for the pain, the cold, and the exhaustion, for they had been the price of admission to this celestial concert. The final light of the sun vanished, replaced by the silver glow of a rising moon. The ice glittered like a field of diamonds, and the synths transitioned into a haunting, lunar melody. Ilara took her first step downward, her movements still dictated by the rhythm of the heights. She was moving into the unknown, into the deeper layers of the mountain's secrets, but she moved with the confidence of one who has heard the song of the stars. Chapter 8. The Resonance of the Soul. As Ilara navigated the first few yards of the descent, she found that the music did not diminish. It merely changed its key. The triumphant chords of the summit gave way to a steady, grounding drone that guided her feet. The thin air music had become a permanent part of her internal architecture. She realized that she would never truly be alone again, for the mountain would always be singing inside her. Every breath she took, however shallow, was a testament to her survival. The silence of the night was no longer something to be feared, but a space where her own thoughts could resonate with the clarity of a mountain spring. She thought of the others who had climbed before her, and those who would come after. She felt connected to them through the music, a lineage of spirits who had all, at one time or another, heard the triangle ping in the void. The air remained thin, the cold remained biting, and the danger remained absolute. But for Ilara, the music was everything. It was the truth behind the struggle, the beauty behind the pain. And as she disappeared into the shadows of the high ridge, the distant, perfect ping of the triangle continued to echo through the void, a promise of the transcendence that awaits all who dare to climb. She was the music, and the music was her. The heavy world of gravity is left behind. The valley rules a fading from the mind. The great peak rises through the frozen mist. By thin and ancient air the soul is kissed. The death zone claims the body and the breath, yet brings a calm that silences all death. As oxygen departs, the soul expands. Above the heavy noise of lower lands, a synth-like hum begins to vibrate deep, while metallic choruses through harness sweep. A tiny triangle pings against the blue, the sound of purpose, focused and so true. She stands upon a rug of prayer and stone, a queen of heights, triumphant and alone. The thin air music echoes in her soul. The mountain's song has finally made her whole.